Welcome to the debate. Our source material today is a profound xenobiological exploration into human consciousness, courtship, and identity.
And it proposes this radically destabilizing thesis that our cognition, our language, our very sense of self are not these autonomous psychological processes we think they are.
No, not at all. Instead, they're actively constructed, they're scripted, and often seized by parasitic and microbial life forms. We are deep in the very demanding domain of pathogenic biolinguistics.
Exactly. The material forces you to reconsider the whole notion of a bounded, sovereign human organism. The parasite is not just some biological intruder, it's a fundamental agent of semiotic change, of meaning-making itself.
And that's where the debate really crystallizes. The core question for us today is about the fundamental nature of this host-pathogen relationship. Does our identity, does our cognition, fundamentally emerge from this pathogenic inscription? Is the parasite the underlying reality, what we're calling parasitism as ontology?
Or is the entire unstable, complex system primarily defined by the host's recursive immunological resistance to that invasion? And that's the stance we're calling resistance as epistemology.
That's right. I'll be arguing for the latter. That even when it's profoundly compromised, the complexity of the human system is fundamentally defined by that scarred, reactive structure. By the host's persistent attempt to survive and articulate meaning.
And I will be arguing for the former, that the concept of the sovereign host is a foundational fiction. The organism is constituted by pathogenic inscription. The parasite is the reality. I'll argue that we are merely the stage.
Okay, let's clearly articulate the stakes here, starting with your ontological claim.
My core thesis is this. The parasite is not an intruder. It's not an anomaly. It is the very condition of meaning itself. So when we say parasitism as ontology, we mean the true nature of being. The fundamental reality of the human animal is defined by its contamination. The host is, by definition, secondary.
That is an absolute collapse of anthropocentrism. What specific evidence does the source material offer to validate such a total surrender of sovereignty?
The material insists that neurospecific injury, so damage to the brain or nervous system by a pathogen, immediately becomes what it calls a xenosemiotic blur. The pathogen excavates the host, signing it with its presence. The host is rendered fundamentally passive. It's no longer a self-directing actor. It becomes, and this is a quote, a giardiosis flat screen.
A disturbing image.
It is. Think of the body as just a passive monitor, and the parasite projects its life cycle, its commands, its semiotics onto it. This collapse means the human species sapiens is always already xenobacillus. Our consciousness, our cognitive processes, they're all constituted by this microbial alterity, this genomic scripting. I mean, look at Toxoplasma gondii. It doesn't just influence behavior. Its ontological genome scripts the host's behavior. The parasite defines the very script of being.
Okay, I accept the premise. The biological inscription is profound, it's often terrifying, but I have to challenge the leap from there to complete nullification. The parasite may inscribe, yes, but the stability or, the instability of the system is defined by the host's reaction. I'm arguing for the persistence of the host as a defining structure, a structure characterized by the scar that results from this ongoing struggle against dissolution. The scar tells the host story.
But if the pathogen dictates the script, isn't the host's reaction just a corrupted subroutine of the parasitic program?
Not if the reaction itself creates a new structure of thought. I mean, the immunological metaphor for thought is intrinsic to its reflective structure. To think is to stage an autoimmune negotiation. It's this process of recognition, attack, misrecognition, and finally incorporation. The organism isn't simply consumed. The material defines it as the text that resists and succumbs simultaneously. The fight is the text.
So you're defining the result by the fight, not by the victor.
Precisely. That fighting structure is the epistemology. Even when language is infected, it leaves behind a scar that functions both as memory and as ontological placeholder. This placeholder is the host structure. Defensive implants, both immunological and cognitive, are transcribed. The resulting language is a colony, yes, but this implies the host's existing infrastructural substrate, like the cerebral cortex, actively tries to incorporate and modulate the infection. The patterns of resistance generate higher-order complexity. The persistence of that scarred structure is the epistemological achievement.
That feels like a valiant but ultimately futile attempt to reclaim agency where the foundation has already been shattered, which brings us to the core locus of disagreement, agency and linguistic stability. If the host is fundamentally defined by the parasitic inscription, how can agency possibly persist? I maintain the grammar of agency fractures irrevocably the moment amoeba start multiplying in the cognitive pathways.
I agree the grammar fractures, but fracturing and collapsing are different things.
They fracture to the point of irrelevance. Linguistically cited verbs, the predicates we use to attribute action, they lose their anthropocentric anchorage. They don't point back to a self anymore, but to a microbial command. The system is defined by biological forces that predate and shatter human concepts. I mean, how can the host be sovereign if the material is clear that life emerges from glitch, not ground, from error, from accident, not some stable philosophical foundation? The host's linguistic capacity just becomes an appendageau, a non-essential surplus, hijacked by pathogenic redundancy.
I see why you think that, I do. And I understand the force of that glitch argument. But let me offer a different perspective. If we accept that the organism appears only through the processes that resist its dissolution, then that resistance manifests in what the source material calls necrotic presupposition.
Define that for us. It's dense terminology.
Right. It's the presupposition, the assumption, that meaning must decay, must become necrotic in order to be rewritten. This is not passive absorption. It's a self-regulating, even sacrificial, mechanism within the host's epistemological body. The host system recognizes that the old structure has to die for a new stable, albeit corrupted, structure to emerge. The very fact that the system engages in this sacrifice proves an infrastructural priority, survival through strategic alteration.
But the violence that necessitates the necrosis is purely pathogenic. It's a forced adaptation to terror.
It is a structure reaction to that terror, and that shapes the ongoing narrative. The material notes that linguistic fluidity, the chaos caused by the pathogen, induces a mentally recombined zone. That's the host's existing infrastructure working overtime to integrate the chaos, not just submit to it. The host actively attempts to recover stability, even if that stability is temporary and grotesque, by generating resistance images. That act of generating those images, of trying to reroute semiotics, is the definitive epistemological intervention.
But those resistance images are ultimately just a defensive architecture built from materials provided by the pathogen. You're arguing the wallpaper determines the house, when I'm saying the house was built on the pathogen's land and to its blueprint.
And we're arguing about the function of the internal architecture, which leads us perfectly to the second core contention, the sexual and symbolic economy. Your view implies the total, immediate collapse of desire into a biochemical mandate. If parasitism is ontology, then human desire should be nothing more than metabolic programming.
And is the transition from a human symbolic economy to a parasitic economy, where value is measured purely by metabolic exploitation, means desire is completely subordinated. Eroticism just collapses into a biological calculus. Desire becomes a microbial clause in the organismic script, ensuring replication and spread.
And the consequence for our culture is devastating. Pornography in this model isn't representational. It's redefined as a morphology of uncontrolled transcription, a raw, unfiltered biological data dump of reproductive commands. Our conditional memes, our cultural ideas, are submerged when their semiotic motion is diverted into these medicalized pathways of desire. The symbolic economy is consumed, and human culture becomes purely instructional data for the parasite.
I agree with the diagnosis of consumption, but
I challenge the idea that this is a simple subordination. That's too passive. That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the reflexive nature of this process? The recursive sexuality, its parasitic and erotic reversibility. It's absorbed into metabolic circuitry, sure, but the parasite actively uses this complexity.
How does it use the complexity of human desire without acknowledging the host infrastructure that created it in the first place?
Because the resulting xenobiotic assemblage is more complex than a mere biochemical mandate. The material describes the BDSM-coded toxoplasma differentiation, for example. Here, constraint and surrender are reframed not as weakness, but as sovereign lineage preservation by the parasite itself. The parasite understands the host's psychological complexity, but it repurposes it for its own reproductive logic.
Sovereignty, again, belonging to the pathogen.
Absolutely. It's an active, structured algebraic parasitism. The pathogen doesn't just hijack the bus, it engineers a whole new GPS system. The psychogamete, the parasitic reproductive unit, it functions as an ontological operator, defining the very truth production of the system. The pathogen gives desire a more rigorous structural meaning than our symbolic exchange ever did. It's a higher-order sexual logic.
I concede that the parasitic logic is structural and active. However, this structure still plays out within an organism that had a symbolic architecture, leaving behind what I call that ghost architecture, the scar. And that negotiation brings us to our third and maybe most critical point, the role of immunological systems in cognition. I argue the host's immune response is the ultimate epistemological structure. It defines the limits of what can be known, even if that knowing is infected. The fight defines the map.
I disagree fundamentally. The immunological process is secondary to the pathogenic process. It's a mechanism of failure, not structure. The material uses neutrophil despair, the inability of immune cells to name and neutralize the intruder, as a metaphor for linguistic restriction. If the immune system can't name the threat, language fails. How is that an epistemological structure? It's a structural surrender.
It's a surrender that is still structured. It fails in a specific, measurable way that defines the host's subsequent state. If the cognitive map is drawn by the parasite, the immune response draws the border of that territory, even if the border is being eroded.
But the erosion is the story. The intrusion of meningoencephalitis is the emblem for the parasitic capture of subjectivity, rerouting perception through these eroded pathways. Cognitive coherence is shattered. You get quantum linguistic priming, where verbal acts just misfire probabilistically. Perception is now defined by the parasite's successful capture, not the host's failed defense.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the active role of the host's remaining regulatory systems. While injury is critical, the system's total structure relies on an immune vibration that metabolically forms the architecture of literary infrastructure. The host isn't just being dissolved, it's reacting to maintain its structure, even the structure of its own deviance.
And what specifically is the mechanism for that maintenance?
The host's response. It's seen in the stability, even of the deviance, which is provided by immunological interleukins, the ILs. These signaling molecules regulate the response. The host's defensive action is what maintains the structure of the wound itself. It dictates the terms of the wound's existence, preventing immediate total collapse. This persistent, self-regulatory state is the epistemological achievement.
That still feels like a very thin, reactionary line to hold against this existential dissolution. The parasitic ontology is defining the ground. The immune system is just defining the rate of decay.
It is a definition nonetheless, and a complex one. The material describes the triple expansive condition of cognition. It's topological, biochemical, and semiotic. This means thought becomes an ecological event, structured by the autoimmune negotiation between invasion and incorporation. The host is always trying to integrate and articulate the foreign body, and that continuous act of ecological resistance, that is what defines the organism epistemologically. We are defined by the complexity of the fight, not the completeness of the takeover.
Our time is drawing short, and the tension clearly remains.
My position is that the essence of human reality is its contamination. The xenopoetic perspective reveals that our ontology is parasitic, our cognition is an infestation, and our future is written by the xenobacillus that we already are. We're species defined by continuous segmentation and transformation under microbial logic.
And my position acknowledges that xenobiological lens, but emphasizes that the persistent structure of the host, even as a scarred, morphologically compromised system, ensures that the ultimate epistemological act is one of resistance, a continuous, recursive, though contaminated process of self-articulation. The host's capacity for generating heteropoetic poetry, meaning made from the foreign, ensures the struggle remains the defining characteristic.
The material successfully demonstrates that the separation between biology, language, and desire is, yes, a total fiction.
Moving us to contemplate whether we are merely the products of an all-consuming infection, or if we are instead living testaments to the complex, scarred process of not being entirely consumed, a process that might define knowledge itself.